and we watched as our legal system failed to bring justice to these families and loved ones. 2020 also revealed the incredible strength and resilience of this community as we mobilized and came together to support each other and those around us through mutual aid and protest. We truly embodied the spirit of Fred Korematsu's legacy by engaging in resistance through community care and solidarity. And as we move into 2021, it's important that we continue to carry that legacy with us, that we stand up against injustice and fight for the civil rights of targeted communities. As a community that has experienced over-policing and mass incarceration, we understand that these systems often fail to provide individual and collective safety, security, and support. We understand that we keep each other safe. And so today we invite you to join us in a dialogue on exploring the history of policing and surveillance in our communities and reimagining new visions of safety against state and racial violence through community care and resistance and solidarity. So I'll stop talking soon and pass it over to Becca and Carl to get into things. But first, we wanted to go over our community agreement for this dialogue. First, be open, curious, and respectful. Everybody here knows something, and together we know a lot. Let's honor the different ways that each of us got here today, and remember that today is just a snapshot of each of our journeys. Let's speak to and listen to each other with respect, care, and an open mind. Second, confidentiality. What is said here stays here. It's okay to share lessons learned, but identifiers stay. 3, take space, make space. If you are someone who is usually a little quiet, we ask that you challenge yourself to take more space. And if you are someone who usually talks a lot, be mindful to leave space for others. That may mean taking a beat after a question. 4, intent versus impact. No matter your intention, take responsibility for the impact of your words and actions. If you say something that's hurtful, hold yourself accountable and do your best to apologize and change your behavior to avoid it in the future. 5, be willing to try on new ideas. We're going to be, really opening up our imaginations and pushing ourselves to think beyond, the systems that exist today. And so let's be curious. And with that, 6, accept and expect discomfort. Generative spaces are not always comfortable spaces. And finally, and maybe most importantly, take care of yourself. We'll be talking about some difficult subjects, including racial violence, and it may trigger strong reactions. If you need to take a break and need to step away, please do so. And if there's something that we can do to support you in taking care of yourself, please reach out to myself or any of the other facilitators here. And with that, I will pass it to Becca and Carl to begin talking about our country's history.
Thanks, Linda. And one note, we're recording the presentation parts of this. We're going to turn off the recording for the breakouts. And if you want to make sure that your face doesn't show up on the recording of the presentation, you can just turn off your cameras. Oh, hey, Becca.
Wow. Yeah, so we just wanted to start off today with kind of going over a little bit of the very long history of anti-Asian violence and police violence. It's an overview. It's definitely not an exhaustive history of either topic, but we just thought it would be useful for us to have some kind of basis that we're all working from for today. Go to the next slide.
So there's a long history of anti-AAPI violence in the United States. Of course, we can't go into this history in the short amount of time we have, but it begins in the 19th century with attacks on Chinese communities, lynchings of Chinese people, and impunity for the people who engaged in that violence. And that continued into the present day, the killing of Vincent Chin, to today's anti-AAPI violence. And one of the things that's important to recognize is that the when we go to police for help, oftentimes they end up listening to the white person instead of the Asian American person. And one of the most horrifying examples of that came in the 1990s when Konerak Samtasafom, who was a Southeast Asian 14-year-old boy who was one of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims, um, managed to escape from Jeffrey Dahmer. Two Black women saw him in the alley in distress, bleeding, and they called the police. And the police officers went, talked to Jeffrey Dahmer, believed what Jeffrey Dahmer was saying, and actually returned Konerak to Jeffrey Dahmer. And he was killed later that day. And these police officers, I want to emphasize, it wasn't some sort of bizarre aberration within the police department. They lost their jobs, but then got them back a couple of years later. About a decade later, one of them was elected president of the police union, and both of them ended up serving long careers in the police department. The last of them retired just last year. So Becca is going to go into, the history of policing in the United States and how this all connects together.
Yeah. Yeah, so again, this is a very long history, but I think it's useful to note that the police in this country were really formed in the early 1700s as kind of slave patrols. So their responsibilities included kind of controlling the movements and behaviors of the enslaved population at the time. And then as our country grew and shifted, moved to enforcement of immigration laws, which the first of which were targeting specific racial groups, the Chinese specifically, and enforcing things like the Chinese Exclusion Act. And because of these initial foundations, public safety was really defined by surveillance, criminalization, and persecution of people of color, in particular Black folks. So in enforcing the Jim Crow laws after slavery was ended, that became targeting of Black folks for petty crimes as a way to continue the subjugation of the newly freed Black population in the US, to subjugate them to slave labor again on chain gangs. And, then the police were also called upon to kind of terrorize and intimidate civil rights protesters, the queer community, other oppressed peoples who were rising up at the time. And it was generally to put the comfort of those in power over those who are oppressed.
So as time went on, as we get into the 1970s and 1980s, there's this counter reaction to the civil rights movement where, beginning, with sort of a shift within the LBJ administration and then into the Nixon administration with the rise of the war on drugs and the explicit criminalization of activities that certain political leaders associated with Black, immigrant, and anti-war movements, and really built the system of mass incarceration that kept growing and growing and growing. In the 94 crime bill, one of the things that it did is, in addition to really increasing funding for prisons, also increased federal funding for local police forces and for targeting poor, largely Black communities. This was followed a couple of years later by the 96 immigration laws, which allowed federal, state, and local police to enforce immigration much more aggressively and in ways that really intersected with the criminal justice system. It's the foundation of what came later with the creation of ICE after 9/11, and the way in which immigration enforcement, the criminal justice system, and the sort of anti-terrorist funding all ended up, resulting in this targeting of certain communities, including especially the after 9/11, it was especially intense against Muslim communities with programs like NSEERS, which tracked the Muslim population around the country and in the tri-state area.
And, because this is a day talking about Fred Korematsu, it's an event for the Japanese American community. We thought it was also important to note the role that police have played in our history, and in particular in Japanese American incarceration. So, for years prior to the Pearl Harbor attacks, the U.S. government prepared and made plans for the systematic removal of Nikkei communities, and employed widespread surveillance as a tool to undermine and suppress activism by Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans. And the FBI monitored um, specifically plantation organizers in Hawaii from starting in like 1917, while also kind of talking about and so showing concern for what they called Japanese subversives that were involved in the Universal Negro Improvement Association and the Nation of Islam as early as the 1920s. And Densho has actually reported that J. Edgar Hoover saw Japanese support for Black national groups as evidence of a militant coalition of Black and Asian radicals, kind of uniting what called the colored races against the white man's rule. So there was a long history of surveillance of our community even before the 1940s. Yeah, there was so by 1932, actually, the entire community, Nikkei community, was under like pretty active surveillance by ONI, by the FBI, by the War Department, and other federal agencies. That would often include illegal wiretaps, opening the mail of the Nikkei community, um, accessing private bank account information, breaking into offices and residences of Issei and other Nikkei folks. And this also includes, beginning in the early 40s, active surveillance of and confrontation of national officers of the JACL that were seeking to cultivate informants within the Nikkei community. And as we moved into incarceration, the FBI or the Department of Justice also ran specific wartime camps alongside the War Relocation Authority. But kind of the targeting of the JA community wasn't just by federal authorities. In fact, it was the local San Leandro Police Department that arrested Fred Korematsu, who's here on the slide here. And he was arrested on a street corner for not remaining in his home in violation of the Executive Order 9066, and was actually only later turned over to federal authorities. And similarly, Min Yasui turned himself into a local police station and was arrested by the local police department for breaking the race-based curfew. So the local police and the FBI were really functioning as two sides of the same coin. And then after the war, as a part of our kind of post-war survival, we do just kind of want to mention and note that there was a way in which our community kind of made a bit of a compromise in post-incarceration to be the good citizen that aligned with law and order, which would sometimes pitted us against other communities of color. And one thing that we wanted to discuss today is the ways that this stands in contrast to the legacy of Korematsu of standing up for what is right, even if that means standing up against the police, and stood in, made it complex in order for us to stand in solidarity with other groups who were fighting for civil rights, who had been and are currently today being really targeted violently by the police. So particularly Black folks then, and also now with the Black Lives Matter movement. And, I think there's, we are also seeing the rise now of white supremacists taking very violent action, for example, at the Capitol. and not facing nearly the same kind of police violence, even though they were actively putting us all in danger and our democracy in danger. And from that event, we have seen it's come to more to light the infiltration of our police departments, including the NYPD, but also other police departments by violent white supremacists and alt-right folks. So I just thought that was important to also note all these different trends as well.
So it's important to emphasize as we get to the end of this presentation that AAPIs have not stood on the sidelines in the face of police brutality. One of these photos is a 1975 photo by Corky Lee, actually, showing a Chinese American being brutalized by the police. It appeared on the cover of the New York Post, and it was a moment in a protest of 20,000 Chinese Americans in New York against police brutality. This 1975 protest was to support innocent bystander Peter Yu, who was beaten by police after complaining about their mishandling a minor traffic incident. 20 years later, in 1985, CAV, AAAV, and other API orgs in New York City protested for Yang Xinhuang at the Brooklyn DA's office. Yang Xinhuang was a 16-year-old Chinese American whom New York City police officers shot in the head in Brooklyn. The city ultimately paid a $400,000 settlement in a federal civil rights lawsuit. And this is interesting to note because when CAV, the same organization, organized in 2016 around holding Chinese police officer Peter Liang accountable for the murder of Akai Gurley, CAV was attacked by conservative Chinese American groups, claiming that they didn't stand with the Chinese community when they clearly have a history of doing so, and also standing against police brutality. So, there is this history. That said, we also have to mention moments like the LA riots, where the AAPI community, and particularly the Korean American community, was used to justify police brutality against the Black community. And there's just a lot of this imagery out there, and I think it raises all of these very difficult questions about where we stand as a community in the present moment.
So that was a lot of history and context, and I think we wanted to create space in the meeting today, in the gathering today, for us to get a chance to kind of reflect and think about this long history, this complex history, as Carl was saying, like the ways in which we have stood up against police violence and state violence, the ways in which we have been compromised and or been used through the model minority myth, support of targeting other communities of color. And so we wanted to make some space for folks. So we are going to be gathering in small breakout groups. And we wanted folks to get a chance to kind of like think about, like, how is this really landing for you? Like, how are you feeling after this presentation? To think about things that you have learned or things that you now have questions about. And how you might see this history connecting to today.
I think we're going to shift a little bit more and kind of look at the kind of other side of this, which is that inside of that history of violence, there's also this other history that's really embodied by Fred Korematsu of community resistance, community care, community safety. So we're going to talk a little bit about that history and what we can learn from that, and kind of also imagine for our future what else we can build to keep ourselves and other communities safe from harm and violence. So, the title of this event is We Keep Us Safe, and that is a phrase coined by Zach Norris at the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. And it's this idea that, we as a community, we don't necessarily need to rely on institutions like policing, which have historically harmed us and harm other communities we know very well. And that we actually have we can build our own ways that are restorative and nonviolent and caring and supportive, that we can keep ourselves safe and each other safe. So we'll go through a few examples of what that has looked like in the past. So in the 1970s, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense formed, and really explicitly as a response to police violence against Black folks. And the way they did this most famously were through these armed patrols of police, and kind of flipping the script on policing the police as a way to hold police accountable and know that, you know, their actions weren't going to go unnoticed, especially brutality against other Black people. But this didn't just look like, you know, trying to protect our communities from harm. You know, the next slide. This also meant mutual aid, right? This is about not just protecting ourselves from physical violence, but how do we meet each other's needs from other forms of violence of poverty, the violence of food insecurity. And the Black Panthers really pioneered this model of mutual aid through programs like the Free Breakfast Program, which later became federal law, and making sure that all children have food to eat in schools. And also has been a huge inspiration now for how so many mutual aid projects have sprung up during this really challenging time of the pandemic, knowing that we have the tools we need to support each other when the federal government and the state government can't or won't. So next slide. So another way that this has looked is this example called the Accompany Project. So Carl referenced how in the wake of 9/11, there was increased violence and harassment of Muslim Americans. So this project was a way to train community members to be in solidarity with those people by accompanying them on their commute, and they were trained in the 4Ds of de-escalation. So actually meeting these threats of violence with a nonviolent and restorative ways to make sure that actually let's prevent and address the root cause of this violence that's happening. And, you know, now kind of as a current manifestation of what those original police patrols are, we have opWatch teams. So this became very popular during the Black Lives Matter protests, where police officers were taking very extreme, excessive force against protesters a lot of times. So, you know, just a smartphone or a camera, people have been kind of recording what the police are doing and what ICE is doing, so that when sometimes police officer will assault a protester and say it was in self-defense. And this is a way to combat that and protect the legal and constitutional rights of our right to protest and to assemble. And this is also a really amazing example in Bend, Oregon, that happened, you know, the last few months. So a community came together and surrounded this ICE bus and prevented it from leaving to detain and deport to undocumented immigrants. And I think this really shows that when we come together as a community, and this idea of safety in numbers, and we are moving in unity, you know, they camped out all day, all night, that we can actually really challenge some of these systems that feel really big and scary, and like, you know, we might feel like they have a lot of power, but we also have a lot of power. And so part of trying to build these, you know, alternatives to policing is to really untap what's the power that we have as a community. And, you know, this isn't just something other communities do. This is something the Japanese American community has done and continues to do. And I think Project Bento is an amazing example of that here in New York City. So when the pandemic happened, Japanese Americans came together to provide meals and also check-ins to our seniors and disabled members of the community. And I think that just goes to show that care it's about meeting sometimes our physical and material needs, but also our emotional and mental needs, right? We need to also build these relationships and build this community. And the more that we strengthen it, that leads to these other forms of safety that we can create. So that is a very brief, non-exhaustive list of just some examples of what community safety has looked like in different communities. But you know, now I'm going to invite you all to participate in this guided visualization. So we're going to try and not just think about how community safety has looked like in the past, but also try and imagine what it could look like in the future. So wherever you are, if you want, you can turn your camera off and just kind of get settled in your seat, whatever's most comfortable. And I invite you now, if it's comfortable for you, you can either close your eyes or rest your gaze and just get settled in, taking a deep breath in and out. And we are going to do a practice, an Indigenous practice called 7 generations thinking. So you're going to imagine either our kids or nieces or nephews or whoever we think of as that next generation. And we're going to think of their kids and their grandkids and their grandkids, all the way 7 generations ahead. And we're going to imagine that 7 generations from now, they have built a world that is safe, that they have built community safety that doesn't rely on policing or cages, but that is protected from harm and all types of violence. And in this world that's safe, just imagine that you are stepping out of your New York City home and onto the sidewalk, and you are looking around at this safe city, and just pay attention to what you see in that world. And I invite you to look around in this peaceful place. And then also notice, what does it sound like? What do you hear around you? What's happening down your block or around your neighborhood? And then I invite you to settle into your body and how it feels to feel safe, and pay attention to how it feels on the soles of your feet, all the way up your legs, up your torso, and your spine. How do your shoulders feel? How does your head feel? How do your hands feel? And just take another moment and a few breaths to be in this world that is free from violence. Take a deep breath in and exhale out. And when you're ready, you can come back into the space, slowly open your eyes. And if you would like, you can turn your camera back on. And we are going to kind of hold on to this sense of imagination and visualizing we just did, and come back to that in our small groups. So we are going to have until 12:23 to share what were we imagining, what we were visualizing, and use that as a starting point to do some collective brainstorming around what keeps us safe and what other ways can we imagine community safety looking like. So if you have your breakout room prompt, click to join, and we shall see you back here at 12:23.
Thanks so much, Alexis, for doing that portion of the presentation, especially for the guided visualization. I thought that was so nice. So this concludes our Korematsu Day virtual program. Thank you all so much again for being here. We're so grateful to be in community with you all and to begin having this conversation, and hope that we can continue to have this conversation. And so I just wanted to point out a few resources. If you want to continue this conversation, we hope that you join us in our study group series. New York Day of Remembrance Committee is working with Nikkei Uprising in Chicago to put together a study group series to really dig into these issues. And so on here, you can register at this link, bit.ly/Nikkei Abolition, or you can email dayofremembrance@gmail.com. We also encourage you to support Black-led organizations who are doing this work, including Movement for Black Lives, as well as local mutual aid efforts. mutualaid.nyc is a good place to get started if you're looking for resources. Sorry, if you could go to the next slide. We have a couple announcements that we wanted to share. This year's Day of Remembrance commemoration will be virtual again, and it will take place on February 20th at 1 p.m. Eastern. We will also be offering a remembrance for Corky Lee and really taking time to honor his legacy. And also tonight, the Korematsu Institute is hosting a virtual celebration and tribute to Congressman John Lewis, and that starts at 6 p.m. Eastern. And so if you want more details on that, you can go to korematsuinstitute.org. But thank you so much again. If you have any questions, please reach out to Day of Remembrance NYC at gmail.com. And we all appreciate you and hope that you have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Thanks, everybody.